Fourth Rail Bridge under construction. It's an amazing photo. Just you, and I think, and actually I will compare just next to this, because there's another lovely photo which I like, which has the same kind of impact on it, which is this one of the ship. And with both of them, what you've got is these huge, gigantic structures. So it becomes really important to have the person in the foreground to relate to them. I mean, if I'll just very quickly open this with Photoshop. And if I do something like, where's the spot healing tool? Sorry, zoom in a little bit here. And I would just remove this person, just very kind of briefly, something like that. So the person is gone. It's still an interesting photo, but actually it doesn't have the same impact. I think having the person in there makes the difference. What's also interesting about both, sorry, close that one, both this photo and this one, I think is again in the printing process where the foreground is much darker and the background gets much lighter as well. So with this, your eye, or even though this is a huge structure, your eye is drawn to the person in the foreground first, and it's also drawn over to the crane here, and it sort of creates a slightly different context. And similarly with this one, we've got our eye is drawn up here where it's darkest, where there's place of most contrast, and it fades out as it gets to the background. And yet in reality, although that sort of, you would expect that if it was a misty day, if we look at the shadows on the wall here, this is a bright sunny day. This is bright sunshine. This is not a misty day. But the printing process has been very carefully done to highlight and burn in more detail, so your eye gets drawn to one part, and then it fades out so that the other part becomes supporting. You only notice it afterwards rather than the front part.
Well, you identified something fairly elemental here, I think, and that's the way that light has been employed in these images. Obviously, it's natural light in both these instances. It's existing light that's contributing to the atmospheric perspective that you also pointed out. Very bright sunlight in both cases, very directional in both cases, and I think very deliberately employed here by the photographers, almost as if they've perhaps not waited for terribly long for the right light, but you get the sense that both were familiar enough with the scene, had planned sufficiently that they knew as best they could what they were going to get out of a particular environment for their photograph. And that's where I think in this particular image, or the placement of the figure comes in, because one of the things that's really outstanding, no pun intended, with the figure here is the shadow. Because in spending time with this image, I really wasn't aware of the light at the forefront, as being at the forefront of this image, until that moment I noticed his shadow. And then it all came together. Yeah. How specifically constructed this image is. And so, in earlier photographs, and this would be from the 1930s, but in earlier 19th century photographs, you often had a figure in it for scale. Yes. Right, because in many instances, if the photographer was going out into a landscape, they were first and foremost probably photographing something extraordinary. Many weren't photographing a bog; they would be photographing extraordinary rock formations, extraordinary coastlines, extraordinary mountain profiles, that sort of thing. They would put a figure in for scale because at that time, knowing that many of the people viewing the photograph would possibly never visit those places, they had no context about the scale of it. So you would see a figure placed in them. And this figure is there, I think, for that purpose, but not exclusively.
Mhm.
He's there for us, really, in a sense, to place us in that image and sort of feel the not just the physicality of it, not just the physicality of the engineered objects in the photograph, but feel the presence of the light as well.
With also, I think the other thing with both of these is you get such a sense of futurism. It's retro sci-fi almost, you know, it's from the past as they are. You know, I mean, we look at that for the, you know, the Fourth Rail Bridge now is old, it's centuries old, it's, you know, it's a Victorian time or whatever. It's, we think of it as an old thing. And likewise, this huge ship, you know, is built at a time. And yet that, I mean, it could almost be a spaceship, you know, in that kind of 1920s, 1930s, Buck Rogers, Flash Gordon style of futurism, which now looks so horribly dated. But at the time, you just sort of looked to the future. And it's really strange thinking how different these photos would have looked to the people at the time to how we look at them now as well, I think.
You know, the idea behind each of these images were, as you described it, these were extraordinary accomplishments, right? That in fact beaconed Scotland's engineering ingenuity to the world, right? In both instances, as regards transport, you know, transatlantic liner, or the engineering marvel that was the Forth Bridge. And what I like to think when I see this image, and there are many images of the Forth Bridge and its construction in the MacKinnon Collection, but to me, this is one of the most extraordinary because you really get a sense of the scale here. Now, to keep in mind, this was this was 100 years before there was another bridge. There was nothing else like it, not just across the Firth Forth, not just in Scotland or the UK, but in the world. There was nothing like this. And what it must have been like to stand there on the end of the pier and see this thing unfolding as it was constructed, and then to see those first trains go across. I mean, in Scotland in particular, after the Tay Bridge disaster, not so long before. So what a marvel it must have been. And today, what's our experience? Well, we can experience it from the same perspective, of course, but the way most of us see it is in our peripheral vision going across one of the other two bridges, right? So it's a completely different experience now than what the folks standing in the picture would have experienced in the late 1880s.